All right, this lesson is food safety for school and community gardens, and actually the information is good if you're planting a backyard garden as well. The handout on the screen is one I put together a few years ago when we really became interested in community and school gardens, and it addresses all of the food safety that we need to think about when we're planting a garden. And we will talk a lot about the information that's in this handout throughout the vegetable class. And it is currently being updated by one of our food safety specialists. And so as soon as that is finished, I will make sure that you all get a copy of the updated version. So now I'm going to go to my PowerPoint. All right. So the reason that we want people to garden more is that we need to be doing a better job of eating more fruits and vegetables. And so this is a way to increase access to fresh produce. It's also good for us in terms of physical activity. It gets us outside. It's a learning lab for children as well as adults. Provides a sense of community when you're outside. You tend to meet more of your neighbors and know what's going on in your neighborhood. If you're involved in a community garden, it helps with teamwork building, and it's fun, and it also can save money at the grocery store. And if you have excess produce, we encourage that you donate it to your friends and family or even a food pantry. But there are quite a few things that we need to think about when it comes to food safety. If you pay attention to the news, most of the foodborne illnesses that we've had lately come from fresh produce. And so things like lettuce and tomatoes and peppers and cantaloupe can become contaminated. And often we don't cook these foods. We tend to eat them raw. And so then they have the potential for making us sick. There's different types of contaminants. We have microbes, which are living organisms, bacteria, viruses, and parasites. So you may have heard of E. coli, salmonella, botulism, those kinds of microbes. And then in the garden, we have chemicals, which could include pesticides, herbicides, and even cleaners. There could be physical contaminants, wood, glass, plastic. And then cross-contamination occurs when we bring a contaminant from one place into another that then contaminates the food. There are an estimated 48 million foodborne illnesses in the United States every year. And it may be even more than that, because a lot of times people think it's a stomach bug when more likely it is a foodborne illness. About 3,000 people die each year, especially if they have a weakened immunity. And it comes from a variety of what we call potentially hazardous foods. And so foods that are high in protein or carbohydrates, so things like meats, poultry, fish, eggs, dairy products, cooked grains, cooked vegetables, and then, of course, the fresh produce. The symptoms of a foodborne illness include nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, fever, aches, pains, chills, and you could even have some neurological effects. Some of them can cause an arthritis, and others, like botulism, can affect your nervous system. The people most likely to contract a foodborne illness, again, are the people with a weakened immunity. So that includes pregnant women, infants, young children, seniors, and then people that are getting chemotherapy or have some kind of autoimmune disease, or even people that suffer from hunger and food insecurity when they don't have good nutrition. Most of the concerns in the garden are going to be the microbes, like bacteria. So again, I mentioned E. coli, salmonella, botulism. It's funny to think about a foodborne illness when you're working in soil and getting dirty, but we know that E. coli, for example, can survive in the soil up to a couple of weeks, and so we need to think about how to reduce the risk and even prevent the contamination. For bacteria or microbes to grow, they need food, and it's often the same food that we eat. So if you take a tomato, it's also high in moisture. Bacteria loves moisture. And then if it's left out at the right time and temperature, our temperature danger zone is 40 degrees to 140 degrees. Bacteria can start dividing, and so they grow exponentially. What that means is that you start out, for example, with 10 bacteria, 10 will divide into 20, 20 become 40, 40 become 80, 80 become 160, 160 to 320, and then 640 and 1280, and so on, and to where it's at a number that can make us sick. So we started recognizing that there was a concern with fresh produce, and a lot of times foodborne illness that's been linked to fresh produce often comes from produce that is produced and gone through a commercial operation. So it could be from contaminated water or an employee that's been sick that can start the foodborne illness. And we're eating more raw food, and so even though we want you to wash the outside of the fruit or vegetable, it could be that the microbe is getting up inside the food and we don't cook it so it doesn't go through a kill step, and then it has the potential for making us sick. And so as this was happening, where we're having more foodborne illness from fresh produce, the USDA started researching good agricultural practices, and these are things that can reduce the risk of having a foodborne outbreak. And GAPS provide the same guidelines that we can follow in community gardens. And then in 2011, the Food Safety Modernization Act was legislated that really focuses on prevention. So instead of reacting to an outbreak, what can we do from beginning to end to prevent the contamination? Well, there's several strategies that we need to think about when we're starting to plan our garden. So site and soil selection, sanitation and tool safety, water and irrigation, compost and fertilizers, pest and animal management, and then food safety and the harvesting, storing, and preparing the produce. And that last strategy I'm going to do a separate lesson on, so stay tuned for that. All right, so site and soil selection. If the site you're looking at seems to flood quite a bit, it's probably not a good site to plant a garden. Floodwaters bring in microbes that can contaminate the soil as well as contaminate any produce that's growing there. Also want to think about the animals that are around. If it's an animal crossing where there's a lot of wildlife, they're going to come in and eat your vegetation, and they're going to leave behind waste, again, that can contaminate the soil as well as the produce. You want to think about if there's been any kind of chemicals or contaminants in that particular site, especially heavy metals. So look into the history of the land, and it may be that you need to consult some community experts that can help you out with learning what the land had been used for, and then go from there. And then you also want to think about soil testing. We do soil testing that tests the nutrition of the soil as well as, again, for any kind of contaminants. Some other things, you want to make sure that the site is away from garbage, animal pens, manure and compost piles, any kind of water runoff, septic systems, wells, and so on. Personal hygiene. food garden is really like our kitchen, and we need to make sure that what we're doing in there is clean and safe for food production. And so just like the kitchen, you want to start out with washing your hands before you go into the garden. And washing with plain soap and water. We don't recommend the antibacterial soaps anymore. They seem to cause more stronger bugs, microbes to develop. And so, you know, it's the friction and the washing with the water and the soap and rinsing it that's going to rinse the microbes away. So washing your hands for about 20 seconds and then drying completely with a clean towel or a paper towel. Of course, you don't want to garden when you're sick, especially if you've had vomiting, nausea, diarrhea, fever. And if you're going to be harvesting, it's a good idea to use gloves if you're not able to wash your hands. And then you want to change out of any dirty clothing before you do any kind of food prep. If you would like to set up a temporary hand washing station, it's real easy to do. You just take a clean water cooler, fill it full of warm to hot drinkable water, have a clean dispenser with soap and paper towels and a bucket to catch your wash and your rinse water that then you can dispose of in a sanitary sewer. Sanitation and tool safety. Just like farm and tractor safety, we want to practice good garden safety, so you want to keep your tools clean, sanitized, and in good working order. If you're using a commercial sanitizer, be sure to read the directions on the label. You can make a really simple bleach water with about a teaspoon of plain bleach to a quart of water and put it in a spray bottle. And after you've cleaned your tools and removed any dirt and debris, then you spray them down and you let them air dry. To make sure that there's no bleach residue left on the tool, which can affect your produce, then you want to just, spray them or rinse them with some clean water. You want to remake the bleach solution about once a week because the bleach will evaporate. So review tool safety rules, especially if you're working with kids. And then it's a good idea when you're out of the garden to keep your gardening equipment and utensils locked up to prevent injury and theft. And when you're getting ready to harvest, you want to make sure you use food grade containers. And I will talk a lot more about that when we do the harvesting lesson. Okay. Water and irrigation. Again, we want to make sure that we're using safe drinking water that's not going to contaminate our produce. And so it's a good idea to not use rainwater. You can collect rainwater in a rain barrel if you would like and then use it on your ornamentals. But as the rainwater runs down a roof, it can collect chemicals from the roof as well as waste from wildlife. And so that's why it's not recommended. If you're using well or pond water, it's probably a good idea to get it tested. And you can check with your local health department on that. When you think about your watering schedule, a drip irrigation system is less risky, less risk for contamination. And but then if you have children who like to water, then hoses are fine as long as you keep them out of standing water. And if you're really concerned, you can purchase food grade hoses. All right, compost and fertilizers. Compost is a great way to amend the soil, but if you use manure, it needs to go through 2 heat treatment cycles to kill off any harmful bacteria. Remember I said that E. coli could live on surfaces for several days to weeks, and so we need to do the composting. So what that means is that you'll start your compost pile, and then you want to turn it every day and check the temperature. And you can buy a garden thermometer at your local garden store. It needs to reach a minimum temperature of 130 degrees for 5 days straight. And then you go through that second cycle, and then you want to let it cool off. We do recommend that you only use manure that comes from plant-eating animals. Animals that are omnivores, you know, their manure is most likely more contaminated. Once the compost is cooled, again, it's probably a good idea to try to do this in the fall, and then it's cooled off, and then you can amend your soil, and then it's got the rest of the fall and the winter till you get to spring planting for it to settle in and continue to stay food safe. If you need to use a fertilizer, of course, the first thing is to get a soil test, which will tell you what nutrients your soil needs. And then if you do use a fertilizer, you want to make sure that you read and follow the instructions that's on the label, and then store it safely. Pest and animal management. Most pests can be minimized by following good gardening practices like weeding and mulching and using beneficial insects. It's a good idea, though, to learn more about the particular pests that you want to get rid of, because sometimes the pests are really beneficial insects as well. They're pollinators, and they're things, you know, organisms that we want in the garden. And it may mean that you just need to plant a little bit more food for them. You do want to, again, keep animals out, and so you may need to use fencing or some kind of barrier. And remember to wash your hands if you've played with your pet before you go into the garden. Okay. This is a lot to think about when you're planning your garden, and as I mentioned, Ariel and I will talk about food safety throughout the entire training. If you're new to gardening, you might want to get a notebook and keep a garden journal to plan and document what you're doing as your garden grows. And then when you're ready to harvest, be sure to watch our video on harvesting your produce safely. If you think about any questions, be sure to ask in class. Or don't hesitate to call us at 785-232-0062, or we have lots of information posted on our website at shawnee.ksu.edu.